Mason Noah had built his empire on dominance, territory, and the absolute certainty that power could solve any problem. Those same instincts had driven him to install military-grade surveillance throughout his sprawling estate, not out of paranoia for his fortune, but out of terror for his son. 4-year-old Michael had been claimed by the wasting sickness 6 months earlier, a cruel affliction that targeted young alphas before their first shift, draining their life force like water through cupped hands. The pack's finest healers had tried everything: bloodletting rituals, imported medicines that cost more than small kingdoms, even a desperate consultation with a witch from the Shadowlands who demanded payment in memories. Nothing worked. Michael's golden eyes grew dimmer each week, his small chest rising and falling in breaths that seemed more fragile than spider silk. Since the diagnosis, the mansion had filled with an endless parade of nurses, healers, and specialists who came and went like ghosts through the marble halls. Some were genuinely compassionate. Some treated the dying pup like a fascinating medical puzzle. Others simply counted the hours until their lucrative contracts ended. Mason had learned, through bitter experience, that not everyone treated a fading child with the reverence his bloodline deserved. A healer who cut corners when she thought no one watched. A nurse who spoke to Michael as if he were already gone. An herbalist who sold the family's desperation to rival packs for gossip and gold. Each betrayal carved another layer of ice around Mason's heart. So he hid cameras throughout the nursery wing, pinhole lenses embedded in crown molding, audio feeds disguised as decorative stones, thermal sensors hidden behind oil paintings of his ancestors. He told himself it was only to keep Michael safe, to catch the moment when someone's carelessness might cost his son the few precious days he had left. Yet even as the feeds streamed continuously to his private study, Mason found himself unable to watch them anymore. Seeing his son's daily decline through a digital lens felt like witnessing his own failure in high definition, a constant reminder that for all his alpha strength, all his wealth and influence, he couldn't fight an enemy that lived in Michael's own blood. When the previous nurse resigned abruptly, citing the oppressive atmosphere and the inevitability of the situation, Mason hired a replacement without ceremony or expectation. The agency sent over a woman named Charlotte. She was unremarkable in every way the pack valued. No prestigious bloodline, no medical credentials, no carefully crafted deference to his status. Her resume was sparse, her references were brief but earnest, and she wore clothes that looked like they'd been mended more than once. During the interview in his imposing study, she didn't compliment the ancestral portraits or comment on the hand-carved mahogany furniture. She asked only one question, her voice steady and soft. "Does Michael like music? Or stories? What makes him smile?" Mason had barely registered the question at the time, too exhausted to care about anything beyond finding someone who wouldn't abandon his son before the end came. The first 3 days passed in a blur of routine. Charlotte kept the nursery immaculate, prepared bland meals that Michael barely touched, and followed the complex medical schedule with precision. Mason, drowning in pack business and late-night meetings with rivals circling his weakened position, barely saw her. He communicated through terse notes left on the kitchen counter, instructions without conversation. Michael, however, began to change in small ways Mason couldn't quite identify. The pup who once lay motionless for hours started turning his head toward the nursery door when Charlotte's footsteps approached. His eyes, those fading pools of gold, seemed to track her movements with something Mason hadn't seen in months. Interest. Hope perhaps, or maybe just the instinct of a dying creature drawn toward warmth. One evening, Mason returned home earlier than usual, his nerves frayed from a territorial dispute that had nearly turned violent. He poured himself a glass of whiskey in his study, then found himself staring at the bank of monitors he'd been avoiding for weeks. He told himself he was just checking that Charlotte had followed the medication schedule. He expected nothing. Perhaps that was why what he saw stopped his heart mid-beat. On the screen, Charlotte sat cross-legged on the floor beside Michael's bed, not administering medicine, not checking vitals, not performing any of the tasks he paid her for. She was simply there, her breathing slow and deliberate, eyes closed, palms resting gently on the ornate rug that had been in his family for generations. After a long, suspended moment, she whispered something too soft for the microphone to catch clearly. Michael, propped up on pillows that seemed too large for his shrinking frame, watched her with an intensity Mason hadn't seen since before the sickness began. The boy's small shoulders, usually hunched with exhaustion and pain, gradually relaxed. Mason leaned forward, his whiskey forgotten, the glass sweating condensation onto the leather armrest. Charlotte began tapping her fingers against the floor, a rhythm so subtle it was almost felt rather than heard. Then, to Mason's complete bewilderment, she reached beside the bed and picked up 2 wooden spoons from a small basket he didn't remember authorizing. She placed them carefully in Michael's weak hands, folding his fingers around them with the patience of someone handling sacred objects. Michael hesitated, confused, his arms trembling with the effort of holding even such light weight. Then slowly he tapped the spoons together. Once. The sound was pathetic, barely audible. Charlotte smiled. Not the professional, measured expression of a hired caregiver. Not pity or sadness. Something raw and luminous blazed across her face as she began tapping the floor in response, matching his rhythm, then elaborating on it. Michael's eyes widened. He tapped again, harder this time, and a sound escaped his throat that Mason had thought lost forever. Laughter. Weak, breathy, but unmistakably real. Mason's hand tightened around the whiskey glass until his knuckles went white. This wasn't in any healer's protocol. It wasn't medicine or proper treatment or anything his money had bought. It was something else entirely. The feed continued. Hours later, Charlotte adjusted Michael's blankets with excruciating gentleness, speaking to him in low tones that the camera couldn't quite capture, but that made the boy's face soften with something like peace. She spoke to him not as a dying pup to be managed, but as a person worthy of conversation, of dreams, of a future that medical charts said he didn't have. Mason sat in the dark study, the monitors casting cold blue light across his face, and felt the first crack appear in the fortress of control he'd built around his grief. Something was happening in that nursery. Something he didn't understand. Something that defied every rational principle he'd built his life upon. And for the first time in months, he felt a dangerous, terrifying emotion stirring in his chest. Hope. But hope, he knew from bitter experience, was often just another word for the moment before complete devastation. So he watched, and waited, and tried to ignore the way his son's laughter echoed in his mind long after he'd turned the monitors off and stumbled toward a bed he rarely slept in anymore. What he didn't know, couldn't know not yet, was that Charlotte's tapping rhythms weren't random. They were the first step of something ancient, something forbidden, something that would challenge everything Mason believed about power, protection, and the price of saving the one thing in the world he loved more than his own life. The cameras would capture it all, and they would change him forever. Charlotte's arrival had been as unremarkable as autumn rain. She'd stepped through the mansion's towering entrance with a single worn canvas bag slung over her shoulder, her eyes passing over the imported marble floors and crystal chandeliers with the same mild interest someone might give a particularly well-maintained public library. No gasps of awe. No careful tiptoeing as if afraid to disturb the grandeur. She simply walked through Mason's carefully curated monument to power as if it were just another building with walls and a roof. Mason had watched from the second-floor gallery, arms crossed, as the head of household staff, a severe beta named Margaret, gave Charlotte the standard tour. Most new hires performed a specific dance at this point. Excessive compliments about the architecture, careful questions about the alpha's preferences, strategic positioning to demonstrate their understanding of hierarchy. Charlotte did none of these things. She nodded politely at Margaret's explanations, asked practical questions about laundry schedules and grocery deliveries, and requested permission to rearrange the nursery furniture, if it would help Michael be more comfortable. "The nursery has been arranged by professionals," Margaret had replied, her tone frosted with disapproval. "Specialists in pediatric care environments." "I'm sure they did their best," Charlotte said, her voice carrying no challenge, no deference, just a simple statement of fact. "But Michael isn't a medical case study. He's a little boy who needs to feel like he's in a home, not a hospital." Mason's jaw had tightened. The audacity of this plain, unremarkable Omega to question decisions made by experts who charged more per consultation than she'd likely earn in a year. He'd been on the verge of intervening, of establishing boundaries before she grew too comfortable with familiarity. But something stopped him. Maybe exhaustion. Maybe the hollow recognition that all the experts and their carefully arranged environments hadn't done a damn thing to save his son. He'd turned away from the gallery and returned to his study, leaving Charlotte to her naive ideas about what a dying pup needed. That had been 4 days ago. 4 days during which Mason had maintained his distance, communicating only through Margaret or terse notes about medication schedules and dietary restrictions. He told himself he was allowing her time to settle in, to understand the gravity of Michael's condition before she, too, realized the futility and submitted her resignation. But on the 4th night, alone in his study with a stack of territorial contracts he couldn't focus on, Mason found his eyes drifting to the dormant monitors. He'd meant to disconnect them entirely, to spare himself the torture of watching Michael's decline. Yet his hand moved almost of its own accord, powering up the main screen that fed directly from the nursery. The room appeared at first as it always did, soft lamplight casting long shadows, medical equipment standing silent vigil beside the oversized bed where Michael lay propped on pillows. But something was different. The sterile silence that usually pressed against the speakers like a physical weight had been replaced by something else entirely. Charlotte sat on the floor beside Michael's bed, close enough to touch but not touching, her shoes removed and set neatly aside. She was humming. Not a lullaby or children's song, but something older, something that felt like it had roots running deeper than memory. The melody rose and fell in patterns that seemed almost mathematical in their precision, yet utterly organic, like water finding its course through stone. Michael, who typically lay motionless except for the shallow rise and fall of his chest, had turned his head toward her. His eyes, those fading golden pools that haunted Mason's dreams, were open wide and focused with an intensity the doctors said shouldn't be possible given his deteriorating condition. Mason leaned forward. His breath caught somewhere between his chest and throat. Charlotte's humming shifted, and then she began tapping her fingers against the hardwood floor. Not randomly, but in deliberate rhythm, creating a percussion that complemented the melody still resonating in her throat. Tap tap, pause, tap tap tap. The pattern repeated, varied, evolved. She made it look effortless, as if this was simply how one existed in the presence of a dying child. Then Michael moved. His right hand, which had barely possessed the strength to hold a spoon during meals, lifted from the blanket and tapped against the bed frame. Once. Tentative. Testing. Charlotte's humming never faltered, but her eyes opened and found Michael's, and the smile that crossed her face was luminous enough to make Mason's chest ache. She altered her rhythm, slowing it, simplifying it, making space for Michael's contribution. The pup tapped again, and again. His movements were weak, uncoordinated, but undeniably purposeful. He was trying to match her pattern, to join this strange new language she'd introduced into his carefully sanitized world. "That's it," Charlotte murmured, her voice barely audible through the speakers but clear enough that Mason could hear the warmth woven through every syllable. "You hear it, don't you? The heartbeat under everything. The drum that keeps the world turning." Michael's lips moved, forming words too soft to reach the microphone, but Charlotte leaned closer as if he'd spoken directly into her ear. "Yes," she said, laughing gently. "It does sound like running horses, like thunder rolling across hills. Like your papa's footsteps when he comes to check on you at night and thinks you're sleeping." Mason's hand flew to his mouth, pressing hard enough to hurt. She knew. Somehow this strange, unremarkable Omega had noticed his nightly vigils, the moments when he stood in Michael's doorway and watched his son breathe, counting each inhalation like a miser counting his last coins. Charlotte began tapping a new pattern, faster now, more complex. Michael's eyes lit up with something Mason hadn't seen in months. Delight. The pup tried to follow, his fingers fumbling, failing, trying again. He wasn't frustrated by his weakness. He was playing. The humming returned, layering over the percussion, and Charlotte started swaying slightly, her whole body becoming part of the rhythm. She was building something, Mason realized, constructing some kind of sonic architecture around his son. The melody wrapped around Michael like a blanket woven from sound itself, and with each passing moment, the boy seemed more present, more anchored to the world of the living. "Close your eyes," Charlotte said softly. "Can you feel it in your bones? That's your pack calling to you. That's your blood remembering how to be strong." Michael's eyes drifted shut, his small hand still tapping against the bed frame, and for the first time in weeks, his breathing seemed to deepen, to steady, to find a rhythm that matched Charlotte's humming. Mason sat frozen in his study, watching this impossible scene unfold. No medical equipment, no expensive treatments, just an Omega sitting on his floor, humming melodies that shouldn't mean anything, creating patterns from nothing but sound and intention. And somehow, impossibly, his dying son was responding. The rational part of Mason's mind catalogued this as temporary comfort, a brief respite before the inevitable. But a deeper, more primal part of him, the alpha instinct that had built empires and defended territory, recognized something else entirely. Magic. Not the flashy, transactional magic of witches and warlocks, but something older, something forbidden. And his son was glowing in its presence like a flower turning toward the sun. The rhythm sessions continued for 3 more nights. Mason watched them all, unable to tear himself away even as pack business piled up and territorial disputes went unanswered. Each evening, Charlotte would sit with Michael, building bridges of sound between the living world and wherever the wasting sickness was trying to drag him. The pup's improvement was subtle but undeniable, a little more color in his cheeks, slightly steadier breathing, moments of clarity that lasted longer each day. But on the 4th night everything changed. Mason had settled into his usual position in the study, whiskey untouched, monitors casting their blue glow across paperwork he'd long since given up pretending to read. The nursery feed showed Charlotte standing by the window, but her posture was different tonight. Purposeful. When she turned from the moonlight, her expression carried a gravity that made Mason's instincts flare with warning. She crossed to the corner where Margaret had begrudgingly allowed her to store a basket of what she'd called sensory items, kitchen implements that had seemed harmless enough at the time. Now, watching Charlotte remove them with ritualistic precision, Mason felt the first stirrings of real unease. 2 copper pots, their surfaces worn to a dull shine. Wooden spoons of varying lengths. A small brass bell. A ceramic bowl so old its glaze had cracked into patterns that looked like ancient script. Charlotte arranged these objects in a circle around Michael's bed, her movements following patterns that resonated with something deep in Mason's genetic memory. This wasn't random placement. This was geometry. Sacred geometry that his kind had been taught to fear and forget. When the circle was complete, Charlotte stood at its western edge and closed her eyes. Her lips formed words Mason couldn't hear through the speakers, and when she began to hum, the sound was nothing like her gentle lullabies. This melody had edges. It pressed against the microphone, distorting the audio in ways that made Mason's skin prickle. She picked up the wooden spoons and struck the first copper pot. The sound rang out clear and commanding, and Michael's eyes opened immediately. The pup didn't look startled or afraid. He looked like he'd been waiting for this. "Tonight," Charlotte said, her voice transformed into something formal and ancient, "we call the sun down into the shadow. Tonight we bind what is fading to what endures." Mason's blood turned to ice in his veins. He knew those words. Every alpha in his bloodline knew those words, passed down through generations as cautionary tales. The Sunlink. An Omega ritual so dangerous his pack had outlawed it a century ago, burning every text that described it, exiling anyone who dared speak its methods. The ritual was supposed to be extinct, its practitioners long dead, its secrets lost to purposeful erasure. Yet here was Charlotte, with her plain clothes and unremarkable resume, speaking the forbidden invocation as naturally as breathing. She struck the pot again, establishing a deep, resonant rhythm, then gestured for Michael to take the brass bell from his pillow. The pup's hand shook with effort, his weakness evident, but the moment his fingers closed around the bell's handle, something ignited in his eyes. Not hope, certainty. Ring when I strike, Charlotte instructed. Let your sound answer mine. Your heartbeat to my heartbeat. Your breath to my breath. Michael rang the bell. The high, clear chime wove through the pot's bass note, creating harmonics that seemed to transcend sound and become something physical. Mason felt it in his chest, in his bones, in the primal part of his brain that remembered when alphas and omegas were partners in power rather than hierarchy and submission. Charlotte began to circle the bed, striking different vessels, layering rhythms until the nursery transformed into something between a temple and a forge. With each circuit, she chanted in a language that predated modern pack speech. From earth, the roots that anchor. From water, the current that cleanses. From fire, the flame that protects. From air, the wind that carries. At each cardinal point she paused and struck a different pot, and Michael followed with his bell, the sound growing impossibly stronger with each repetition. His breathing locked into sync with her rhythm, his small chest rising and falling in perfect time with her percussion. Then Charlotte knelt and lifted the ancient ceramic bowl, cradling it between her palms. She closed her eyes and hummed a single sustained note, and the bowl began to glow. Soft amber light at first, then brightening to gold, then blazing like captured sunlight. Mason's logical mind insisted this was impossible, that he was hallucinating from exhaustion, that the cameras were malfunctioning. But his alpha senses knew better. This was real. This was power that made his territorial dominance look like a child's game. Charlotte's eyes opened, glowing with the same golden light as the bowl, and she locked her gaze on Michael. Michael Noah, pup of the giant Alpha, heir to the Northern Territories. Her voice resonated with authority that should have been impossible for an Omega. I call your spirit back from the Shadowlands. I anchor your soul to the living world. By the old covenant, by the first bond, by the magic that predates all our forgetting, I bind my strength to yours. She placed the glowing bowl on Michael's chest. Light exploded outward, flooding through the pup's small frame like liquid gold replacing blood. Michael arched, gasping, and Mason's hand shot toward the door controls, ready to burst in and end this before. Michael's gasp became laughter, pure ringing alive. The light pulsed in rhythm with the pup's heartbeat, visible through his nightshirt, and Charlotte leaned close, whispering promises that Mason had to strain to hear. You will run with the pack and feel wind in your fur. You will hunt under the full moon. You will grow strong and fierce and kind. You will protect those who need protecting. You will not fade into shadow. You will burn. You will live. Each promise sent another wave of golden light through Michael's body. His gray skin flushed pink. His labored breathing steadied and deepened. The Death Mason had been watching claim his son inch by inch reversed before his eyes. Charlotte lifted the bowl away and the light faded, but Michael remained transformed. His eyes were clear and bright, and when he spoke, his voice rang with strength that shouldn't have existed. I felt it, Charlotte. A son. Inside me. Like it was always meant to be there. It was, she said softly, taking his hand. The sickness tried to steal your light, but we called it home. It never left you, little one. It was only sleeping. Mason sat frozen in his study, watching this impossible woman settle his miraculously improved son back into the pillows. She'd performed forbidden magic with kitchen pots and sheer will, achieving what a fortune in medical care couldn't accomplish. He should have been furious. Should have been terrified. Should have been calling the pack elders to report this violation of ancient law. Instead, he found himself asking a question that terrified him more than any answer could. If this Omega could call his son back from death's door, what else might she be capable of? And what would it cost them all when the pack discovered what she'd done? The giant Alpha hid cameras to watch his dying pup, until he saw the Omega unleash a forbidden bond. The alarm sliced through the mansion at 3:47 a.m., a sound Mason had programmed himself never to ignore. The medical monitor in his study erupted in a cascade of red warnings, each one a knife to his chest. Heart rate plummeting. Oxygen saturation. Critical. Respiratory function failing. Michael was dying. Mason's chair toppled backward as he lunged for the door. His alpha instincts screaming at him to run, to fight, to tear apart whatever invisible enemy was stealing his son's breath. His hand was on the doorknob when the camera feed on his phone caught his eye. A single frame that stopped him cold. Charlotte was already there. She had Michael cradled against her, the pup's tiny body limp in her arms. But she wasn't panicking. She wasn't reaching for the emergency call button or the oxygen tank Mason had installed at grotesque expense. Instead, she was whispering something Mason couldn't hear through the silent feed. Her lips moving in a rhythm that seemed to match the frantic beeping of the monitor. Mason's fingers trembled on the doorknob. Every fiber of his being demanded he burst through that door, seize his son, call the specialist team he kept on retainer for exactly this moment. But something in Charlotte's posture, the absolute certainty in her movements, held him frozen. She laid Michael gently on the bed, then did something that made Mason's blood run cold. She pulled the boy's small hands to her chest, pressing his palms flat against her heart. The forbidden bond. The ritual his pack had outlawed 3 generations ago, when an Omega had nearly died trying to save an Alpha's mate. It was too dangerous, they'd said. Too unpredictable. Price too high. Through the screen, Mason watched Charlotte close her eyes. Her lips moved faster now, and even without sound, he could see the ancient words taking shape. The camera caught the moment her entire body shuddered, a tremor that started in her core and radiated outward like ripples on still water. Michael's chest remained terrifyingly still. Charlotte's voice must have risen because suddenly Mason could hear fragments through the feed's audio, words that shouldn't have been possible through the door. Feel it, little one. Feel my heart. That's your drum now. That's your rhythm. She began to rock, a motion so slight Mason almost missed it. Forward and back, like the tide pulling at the shore. With each movement, she drew Michael's hands more firmly against her, until the pup's fingers splayed across the place where her heartbeat pulsed strongest. "You're running," Charlotte whispered, and this time her voice came through crystal clear, as if she'd stepped right up to the hidden microphone Mason had embedded in the lamp. "You're running through a field, Michael. Can you feel it? The grass under your feet. The wind in your face." Mason's own heart hammered as he watched Michael's eyelids flutter. "You're so fast, little wolf. Faster than the wind. Faster than fear." Charlotte's voice dropped to something primal, something that made the hair on Mason's neck stand straight. "Feel my legs running. Feel my lungs filling. Feel my strength, it's yours now. Take it. Take what you need." The monitor's alarms shifted pitch. Mason's eyes darted to the readings on his phone screen. Michael's heart rate was climbing, impossibly miraculously climbing. But Charlotte's was dropping. She was giving him her breath, her life force, everything. "No," Mason breathed, his hand tightening on the doorknob. This was wrong. This was too much. No one should have to sacrifice themselves like this, not even for his son. He couldn't watch another person fade because of his family's curse. But Charlotte kept speaking, her voice steady even as her body trembled with effort. "Your father's watching, you know," she said, and Mason froze. "He's always watching. But tonight, he's going to see something he's never seen before. He's going to see you breathe." Michael's chest rose. A tiny expansion barely visible, but there. "That's it, warrior." Charlotte's smile broke across her face like dawn. "Again. Follow my breath. In and out. In and out." Michael's second breath came stronger. Then a third. The monitor's shrieking alarms began to quiet, replaced by the steady beep of a stabilizing heartbeat. Charlotte didn't let go. She kept Michael's hands pressed to her chest, kept rocking that ancient rhythm, kept pouring her strength into him until his breathing synced perfectly with hers. 2 hearts beating as one. 2 sets of lungs rising and falling in perfect harmony. Mason watched through the camera as color returned to his son's cheeks. As Michael's eyes opened, truly opened, for the first time in weeks. As the pup looked up at Charlotte with something that might have been recognition or might have been awe. "There you are," Charlotte whispered, and her voice cracked with exhaustion. There's my brave boy. She finally released Michael's hands and laid him gently back on the pillows. The pup's breathing continued on its own now, steady and strong. Charlotte swayed on her feet, catching herself on the bedpost, and Mason saw the cost written in every line of her body. She'd given everything, and she'd saved him. Mason's legs gave out. He sank to the floor outside the nursery door, his phone still clutched in his shaking hand, the camera feed showing Charlotte stroking Michael's hair as the boy drifted into his first peaceful sleep in months. All his cameras, all his money, all his power and preparation and control. None of it had been able to do what this plain Omega had done with nothing but her voice, her touch, and her willingness to sacrifice everything. He had watched her perform a miracle, and he had done it from behind a screen like a coward. Mason pressed his forehead against the door, listening to the sound of his son's steady breathing on the other side. For the first time in his life, the mighty Alpha felt small. Mason waited until noon, when Michael was sleeping peacefully and the morning sun had burned away the supernatural terror of the night before. He needed daylight for this confession. He needed to see Charlotte's face clearly when he told her what he'd done. The summons came through Mrs. Hendricks, his head of staff, delivered with the carefully neutral tone of someone who'd learned not to ask questions. Mr. Noah requests your presence in his study, Miss Charlotte. At your earliest convenience. Mason heard Charlotte's response through the nursery monitor. Another piece of surveillance equipment he'd need to confess. Tell him I'll come when Michael wakes. Not before. It was the first time anyone had made him wait in a decade. Mason found himself smiling at the portrait of his father that hung behind his desk. The old Alpha would have raged. But Mason was learning that power came in forms he'd never considered. Charlotte arrived 3 hours later, still wearing the simple linen dress she'd had on during the crisis. Up close, Mason could see the exhaustion carved into her features, the shadows under her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands. She'd given so much of herself that she was still recovering, still rebuilding what she'd poured into his son. You wanted to see me. Her voice was steady but wary. She stood just inside the doorway, maintaining the distance of someone who understood the predator-prey dynamic of their positions. Mason gestured to the leather chair across from his desk. Please. Sit. I'd rather stand. Course she would. He'd taken so much from her already. Her energy, her life force, nearly her spirit. She wouldn't surrender her physical autonomy too. Then I'll stand as well. Mason rose from his chair, moving around the desk to stand before her. Not as an employer before a servant, but as a supplicant before a savior. What you did last night was necessary, Charlotte interrupted. Her chin lifted, defiant. And I'd do it again. I know. Mason took a breath, the words he'd rehearsed all morning suddenly inadequate. I've been watching you, Charlotte. Through cameras hidden in the nursery. From the moment you arrived. He waited for the shock, the outrage, the justified fury. Instead, Charlotte's expression barely changed. Only the slightest tightening around her eyes betrayed her lack of surprise. I know, she said quietly. The confession Mason had prepared crumbled. You knew. I'm an Omega, Mr. Noah. We're taught from childhood to recognize when we're being watched. Her lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. Your cameras are quite sophisticated, but they still need to adjust to low light. The nursery has 13 of them by my count. I found the first one my second day here. Mason felt the ground shift beneath him. All his careful surveillance, his secret observation, she'd known the entire time. She'd performed that forbidden ritual, risked her life, with full knowledge that he was watching from the shadows. Why didn't you say anything? Because you needed to see. Charlotte moved further into the room, her wariness giving way to something more fierce. You needed to witness what I could do for Michael without interference. If I'd confronted you, you would have stopped me. Or tried to control it. Men like you always do. The assessment cut because it was true. Mason would have done exactly that. demanded protocols, oversight, scientific verification. He would have strangled the magic before it could work. "I called you here to apologize," Mason said. "What I did was a violation of your privacy, your dignity. I don't want your apology." Charlotte's voice cut through his prepared speech. "I want honesty. Why did you hire me, Mr. Noah? A plain Omega with no medical background, as your staff so kindly explained. Why did you choose me to care for your dying son?" Mason met her gaze, forcing himself to hold it. "Because you were the only applicant who didn't promise to save him." Charlotte blinked. "Every specialist, every healer, every expert who came through that door made guarantees," Mason continued. "They swore they could cure him, promised their methods were foolproof. They saw my desperation and fed it with lies." He gestured toward the nursery, visible through his study window. "But you sat in that interview and told me you couldn't promise anything except that you'd try to make his remaining time less frightening. You spoke to him like he was already a person, not a problem to be solved. So you hired me to watch him die comfortably." There was no judgment in Charlotte's voice, only understanding. "I hired you because you were honest. And because—" Mason's voice dropped, the confession harder than he'd anticipated. "Because some part of me hoped that if Michael had to die, at least he'd die loved. Not monitored. Not studied. Loved." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sound of the estate's fountain and the soft rustle of Charlotte's dress as she moved closer. "He's not going to die, Mr. Noah. Mason," he corrected automatically. "After what you did last night, you've earned the right to use my name." "Mason," Charlotte repeated, testing the word. "Michael's not going to die. But saving him will require more than what I did last night. The wasting sickness has roots deeper than one ritual can reach. I'll need to perform the full Sunlink ceremony, which takes 7 nights. And I'll need you to stay away." Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to demand a place in the nursery, to maintain some semblance of control. But Mason had seen what his control had accomplished. Nothing. While Charlotte's surrender to something ancient and unknowable had brought his son back from death's edge. "What do you need?" he asked instead. Charlotte's expression softened, surprise flickering across her features. She'd expected a fight. Everyone always expected alphas to fight. "I need the cameras turned off. All of them. What I'll be doing requires privacy. True privacy, not observed privacy. The ritual feeds on trust, and it will know if there are eyes watching." Mason's hand moved instinctively to his phone, to the app that controlled his surveillance network. His finger hovered over the screen. Every fiber of his alpha nature rebelled against this blind faith, this surrender of watchfulness. Then he thought of Charlotte swaying on her feet, pouring her life into Michael while Mason cowered behind a screen. He deleted the app. "Done," Mason said. "The cameras are off. You have complete privacy." Charlotte studied him for a long moment, as if searching for the trap, the contingency plan he must have hidden in reserve. When she found none, something in her posture shifted. "I don't want your fortune, Mason Noah," she said quietly. "I don't want your apology or your gratitude or your guilt. I want your trust. Can you give me that?" Mason thought of all the things his money had bought, the specialists, the equipment, the experimental treatments. None of it had made Michael smile the way Charlotte's pot and spoon symphony had. None of it had brought light back to his son's eyes. "Yes," Mason said, and meant it. "I can give you that." Charlotte nodded once, then turned toward the door. She paused at the threshold, glancing back. "The cameras in the hallways, though, those can stay. James has been lingering near the east wing. I'd feel safer knowing you're watching the approaches." Mason's protective instincts roared to life. "James was here 3 times this week. He watches from the gardens." Charlotte's smile was grim. "I may trust ancient magic, Mr. Noah, but I'm not naive about modern threats. Keep your eyes on the dangers you can see. Leave the miracle to me." Then she was gone, her footsteps fading down the corridor toward the nursery where Michael waited. Mason stood alone in his study, surrounded by the trappings of his power. The imported leather, the priceless art, the wall of monitors he'd just rendered useless. For the first time in his life, the Alpha felt free. The seventh night arrived with a storm that made the mansion's ancient bones creak. Mason stood at his study window, watching lightning illuminate the east gardens where James had been prowling. The cameras Mason had promised to disable in the nursery remained dark, but every other screen in his security array burned bright. He'd learned the difference between vigilance and violation. Inside the nursery, Charlotte was completing the final phase of the Sunlink ceremony. Mason couldn't see it, couldn't monitor it, could only trust that the ancient magic was doing what modern medicine had failed to accomplish. The not knowing gnawed at him, but he held firm. This was what trust felt like. Uncomfortable, terrifying, necessary. The main gate alarm shattered his contemplation. Mason's eyes snapped to the security feed. Two figures approached through the rain. James, his rival Alpha, moving with the predatory confidence of someone who believed he had every right to be there. And beside him, Emma, the pack's head healer, her face set in rigid disapproval. Mason was already moving before they reached the door. He met them in the grand foyer, water pooling at their feet as Mrs. Hendricks took their soaked coats with practiced neutrality. James smiled, all teeth and dominance, the kind of expression that had once made lesser alphas submit. "Mason, we've come to check on the boy." James's tone suggested this was a courtesy visit, but his eyes scanned the hallways with territorial assessment. "Emma's concerned about the unorthodox care he's been receiving." Emma stepped forward, her medical bag clutched like a shield. "Mr. Noah, I've received reports that you've allowed an unlicensed Omega to perform banned rituals on Michael. As his primary physician, I have a duty to." "You have no duty here." Mason's voice cut through her rehearsed speech. "You're not Michael's physician anymore. You haven't been for 6 days." Emma's face flushed. "You can't simply dismiss trained medical personnel because they won't indulge in superstitious. I can dismiss anyone who looks at my dying son and sees only a liability to manage." Mason held her gaze until she looked away. "You wanted protocols. Charlotte wanted to save him. The choice was simple." James laughed, the sound sharp and calculated. "Come now, Mason. We all know what's really happening here. You've been bewitched by a pretty Omega performing parlor tricks while your son wastes away upstairs. Emma tells me he hasn't been seen by actual medical staff in nearly a week. That borders on neglect, brother. The Pack Council might need to intervene." The threat hung in the air between them. Pack Council intervention meant an investigation, potential removal of Mason's custodial rights, everything James had been maneuvering toward since Michael's birth. The rival Alpha had been patient, waiting for Mason to make a mistake desperate enough to justify action. Mason felt the old instincts surge, the need to dominate, to crush this challenge with raw force. 6 months ago he would have let his alpha nature solve this problem the way it solved all problems, with violence barely contained by civility. Instead he smiled. "You want to see Michael?" Mason gestured toward the grand staircase. "Let's go. Both of you. I'll show you exactly what Charlotte has accomplished." James's triumphant expression faltered. He'd expected resistance, threats, the kind of territorial display that would justify his concerns. Mason's acquiescence clearly unnerved him. They climbed the stairs in tense silence. Emma's fingers worried at her medical bag's clasp. James's predatory confidence had shifted to wary calculation. Mason led them down the corridor toward the nursery, his heart hammering not with fear but with something startlingly close to faith. The nursery door was closed. From behind it came sounds Mason had thought he'd never hear again. The bright laughter of a child, the rhythmic tapping of spoons on pots, Charlotte's voice singing something wordless and ancient. Mason didn't knock. He opened the door. The scene that greeted them made Emma gasp and James freeze mid-step. Michael sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by the makeshift instruments Charlotte had gathered. Pots, wooden spoons, metal bowls. His cheeks glowed with color Mason had forgotten his son possessed. His eyes, once dim and fever-glazed, sparkled with mischief as he banged out an enthusiastic rhythm that bore no resemblance to anything musical. Charlotte knelt beside him, matching his chaotic beat with her own, both of them laughing as if the world beyond this room didn't exist. The air itself felt different, warmer, brighter, alive with something Mason's cameras could never have captured. Michael looked up at the sound of the door. When he saw Mason, his face exploded into pure joy. "Papa!" The word was clear, strong, without the breathless wheeze that had haunted every syllable for months. "Listen. I'm making thunder." Mason's knees nearly buckled. Michael hadn't called him Papa in over a year. Had barely had the strength to speak at all. Now his son was shouting, laughing, living. "I hear it, brave one." Mason's voice cracked. "You sound like a storm." Charlotte rose gracefully, her exhaustion evident but her eyes bright with triumph. She met Mason's gaze with a small nod that said everything. "It's done. He's free. The wasting sickness is broken." Behind Mason, Emma made a strangled sound. "This isn't. How is this possible?" "7 nights of forbidden magic," Charlotte said calmly, turning to face the intruders. 7 nights of rituals your medical protocols declared impossible. 7 nights of trusting in something older than your textbooks. She moved to stand beside Michael, protective and proud. "The boy is healed. You may examine him if you wish, Dr. Emma, but you won't find any of your familiar markers of illness. The wasting sickness doesn't exist in him anymore." James recovered first, his alpha nature reasserting itself. "This is madness. Mason, you've allowed banned rituals to be performed on your heir. The Pack Council will. The Pack Council will see a thriving child instead of a dying one." Mason stepped fully into the room, positioning himself between James and Michael. "They'll see an alpha who chose to trust ancient wisdom over modern failure. They'll see that my son lives because I was willing to admit I didn't have all the answers." "You've grown weak," James snarled, "allowing an omega to dictate." "I've grown wise." Mason's voice carried the full weight of his alpha nature now, not as a weapon but as a declaration. "There's a difference, James. One you'll never understand." James's hand moved toward Michael, reaching as if to inspect the child himself. Mason caught his wrist before he could complete the gesture. The physical contact sent a clear message through the pack hierarchy: this far and no further. "You're not welcome in this nursery," Mason said quietly. "You're not welcome near my son. If you have concerns, take them to the Pack Council. But know that when they arrive, they'll find a healthy heir and a father who finally learned that strength isn't just about control." For a long moment, James held Mason's gaze. Whatever he saw there made him step back. "The council will hear about this," James promised, but the threat rang hollow. He turned to leave, Emma scrambling after him, her medical bag forgotten in her haste. When their footsteps faded down the corridor, Michael banged his pot with renewed enthusiasm. "Papa, I scared them away. I was loud like thunder." Mason knelt beside his son, gathering him close for the first time in months without fearing the boy might break. Michael was solid and warm and alive. "You were very loud, brave one. Very fierce." Charlotte watched them with a soft smile, then began gathering her makeshift instruments. "The ceremony is complete," she said. "Michael will need rest, proper food, and time to rebuild his strength. But the sickness won't return." "How can you be certain?" Mason asked, not from doubt but from wonder. "Because I gave him something the wasting sickness couldn't touch, a reason to fight that went deeper than medicine." Charlotte met his eyes. "I gave him joy, Mason. I gave him music and rhythm and the feeling of being celebrated instead of monitored. The sickness fed on isolation and fear. Love starved it out." Mason understood then what his cameras and his control had really cost. He'd been so busy watching for threats that he'd forgotten to give Michael what the boy needed most: the freedom to simply be a child. "Stay," Mason said. "Not as Michael's caretaker. Family. Help me learn how to be the father he deserves, not just the alpha who protects him. Charlotte's smile widened. I think I can do that. Outside, the storm was breaking. Dawn light filtered through the windows, painting the nursery in shades of gold. Michael returned to his enthusiastic drumming, filling the mansion with sound that had nothing to do with alarms or monitors, just the pure, chaotic noise of a child who'd been given back his future. Mason sat on the floor beside his son, picked up a wooden spoon, and joined the symphony. He played badly, with no rhythm or grace. But Michael's delighted laughter told him it was perfect anyway. The cameras stayed off. The mansion transformed from a fortress into a home. And the giant alpha who'd once believed he needed to watch everything learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply close your eyes and trust. Thank you for joining the pack today. If this story pulled you in, make sure to subscribe and tap the moon bell so you never miss the next alpha destiny. And tell me in the comments, who should we follow next under the full moon?